Donald Trump's just this curious contradiction, which you can explain is on the one hand, he's the bully, he's the aggressor, he's the man, the art of the deal, and all that. On the other hand, he's insecure as hell. He really is insecure, and I know that's going to surprise a lot of people. And I can't wait to see the YouTube comments. But at the end of the day, he's this bully that wants to be liked, and it just drives him crazy. He wants the adulation, he wants all of that. He he wants people to pay him tribute. And for that to happen, he can't be like the ultimate villain who enjoys just being a villain. He can't say, yeah, I got away with it. He's the villain who, at the end of the day, wants to be the hero.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford, and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today, I'm joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, and also founder and editor of EA WorldView. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Oh, Joe, it's great to chat with you again.
Next Tuesday, on the 4th of November, New Yorkers will be out trying to... Next Tuesday, on the 4th of November, New Yorkers will be voting to elect a new mayor for the city. At the moment, it appears that Zohran Mamdani is the favourite according to polling data. Do you think that he will be the New York mayor by this time next week?
This is the 34-year-old state assemblyman, who's had this sudden rise in New York City politics. He unexpectedly won the Democratic primary in June. Against other contenders, including the former New York State Governor, Andrew Cuomo. And it was unexpected because Cuomo was leading by 10% going into in the polls, going into the primaries. Well, now here we are back in November, and Zohran Mamdani is running against Andrew Cuomo. In other words, rather than the Republicans facing off against him, Cuomo decided he would run as an independent. His ego was stung, to say the least, by losing to this upstart, this young challenger. And then there's a third candidate named Curtis Sliwa, who I used to remember from the 1980s as being the head of this group called the Guardian Angels that would patrol New York subways to try to protect people. Some said they were essential for security. Others said they were vigilantes. Here we are, 40 years later, and Sliwa's running on a tough on crime approach. Now, for what it's worth with polls, but remember what I just said about the polls back in June. For what it's worth with polls, Mamdani's up between 10 and 18% in the polls going into next Tuesday. So that would seem to give him a significant edge. But we know that polls don't say what actually happens on election day. I would say that the momentum has been with Mamdani for most of this, but that there has been a bit of closing, as it were, in the polling and a bit of a pushback against Mamdani, in part because Cuomo is running a very, very aggressive campaign, in part because Sliwa is picking up a bit of support with that tough on crime stance, and in part because the Trump camp is throwing everything that they can to smear Mamdani. And I do mean smear. We can debate what Mamdani's policies are and what he actually stands for. Trump folks don't give a damn about that. They're just portraying him as either Satan, a communist, the Antichrist, or all three.
There's an argument that if Mamdani does win, this could actually work in Trump's favor. He could use Mamdani as a foil so that he can crack down on federal powers in democratic cities in New York. If Cuomo wins, for example, then Trump could have leverage over the candidate because he's potentially facing an inquiry by the Department of Justice into whether he lied to Congress. Do you see Trump having an upper hand here in any way?
Well, if the Trump folks think they're going to get an upper hand from Mamdani win, they're going about it in a strange way with this all-out smear campaign, and I don't think it holds for this reason. Let me just work through this. Look, New York City, largest city in the United States, one of the largest cities in the world, a city that's larger than many countries. Fair enough. But the idea that Mamdani translates into the nation doesn't really work on a couple of levels. First of all, Republicans and the Trump folks would say New York City is not representative of an Iowa, of a California, of a Texas. Secondly, Mamdani's not focused on national office here. He's focused on New York City. I mean, he is, again, whether or not you agree with him, he's focusing on what he thinks are dealing with the problems of that. He's not pointing at any point that this is a blueprint for the nation. Now, there are Democrats who will say that the policies he's running on, trying to deal with the cost of living by helping people out with rent, housing cost, helping out with transport cost, helping out with childcare cost, helping out with education. Those are policies that could be rolled out, but not through Mamdani, through other Democrats in their cities and in their states. So I think what you have is probably a boost for the Democrats if Mamdani wins, but not in the sense that he's the savior, in the sense of, look, what could this do for us in other parts of the country? And secondly, I think there's a limit that the Trump people can go along. And even if people bought the idea that Mamdani's a radical, that they say that, well, that means Mamdani means the Democratic Party is radical across the United States. Just to put it blatantly like this, New York City politics is pretty much special. So to simply run a version of the 1950s, and this is the 1950s, the way that they're going, communist, evil. He must come straight out of Moscow. You know, diehard Trumpists might buy that. I'm not sure that independent voters would.
There is a big question mark over how Mamdani plans to fund a lot of these policies that he's been campaigning for. There's questions about childcare. Estimates for it appear to be higher than what he's suggesting. Do you think that could play into Trump's favor? You know, he could cite that the city's ungovernable, send in troops to New York. There's also questions about, threatening to withhold federal funding too.
Well, look, first of all, and I think that is a fear, that if Mamdani wins, Trump's going to go to that playbook of, you need to go to me as the authoritarian to put him in his place. And I'm going to put the military on the streets of New York City. Good luck with that, mate, by the way. Putting the military into the streets of New York City. I met people in New York City, and they don't like folks coming in and telling them what to do. So I'm not sure that's going to play out too well. I think, to be honest with you, if the Republicans and Trump are talking about coming back on this, it's actually a more traditional form of politics. And that is, how do you pay for this? How do you fund, these programs that many people would see as essential? And in fact, I'd be fine if the Republicans and Trump said that. That's a way of debating these issues on where they should be discussed, which is, yes, we think they're essential, or at least I think they're essential, but are they economically possible? Are they economically responsible at this point? That said, I think what undercuts Trump and the Republicans is if you want to talk about economic and fiscal responsibility, this is a party that just added $4 trillion to the U.S. debt back in the spring with the big, not so beautiful bill. And perhaps more importantly, this is a party that succeeded in increasing the U.S. debt while cutting key programs, for example, slashing $850 billion off Medicare and Medicaid. In other words, at the national level, when you cut through all the crap, all the disinformation, all the spin, all the general insanity that quite often comes mainly from the Trump folks at national level, it comes down to a question which we know of in the UK, which is, in the debate between reliable public services and in terms of the government being able to pay for this and maintain a sound budget, how do you strike that balance? How do you do that? And at the end of the day, what I've actually found encouraging out of the New York City election is that, for all the mudslinging and all the spectacle, that debate is squarely there in New York City. And I would like to see that debate be held in a sensible way across the United States, because we are in the middle of a government shutdown, which has come about precisely because the Trump Republican approach has been, we're going to cut taxes primarily for the wealthier people in the United States. We're going to jack up the government deficit, throw all this money at the military and at the paramilitary, ICE, to round up people. And meanwhile, when you talk about fundamental services, we're going to get rid of the Department of Education. We're going to slash healthcare. We're going to completely pervert transport. Oh, and environmental protection, whoever needed that. That's a debate that needs to be had by the adults in the room.
Trump has such a personal connection to New York, as well as like business connections with New York. And also New York is seen as sort of like the financial center of the US in many ways. Do you think that the way that Trump will respond to Mamdani if he does win that connection that he has with the city will also be weighing on Trump's mind.
I think Trump has a real complex about how he's treated in New York City that precedes Mamdani. I mean, look, Trump in a way builds his career in that city. I'm the successful businessman. It wasn't quite that way, but we'll deal with that in another podcast. I'm the guy that was on The Apprentice. You're fired. That part is true. But by and large, Trump is a creature now in Florida. I mean, Mar-a-Lago, all the glitz, all the, pseudo gold, the same kind of stuff he's trying to do as he destroys the White House. That was been pretty much in Florida for more than a decade. Now he still has Trump Tower. And of course, he launched the 2016 campaign in Trump Tower, but he lost heavily in 16, 20, 24 in New York State and especially New York City. And indeed, I can remember in 2020 when on election day, he would, or during the campaign in 2020, he was being booed in New York. So part of that might be because New York is more liberal or to the left of other U.S. states, but part of it's because a lot of folks just simply don't like the way that Trump tried to manipulate New York in terms of building up his own reputation. So no, I think if Trump's ego is hurt by Mamdani winning, that's relatively low here. I think the broader thing that you have to look at here is that as we make the run to the 26 midterms, and perhaps more importantly, as Trump is trying to run roughshod, absolutely roughshod over states, putting military on the streets of city, denying states the ability to run their own affairs, completely just insulting and harassing not just Mamdani but other politicians. Mamdani is a broader challenge to that Trump projection. I'm the guy here. I'm the only guy in town, and you don't need this fella in New York coming down my street.
I mean, we've got the midterms coming up next year as well. If Mamdani, if he gets off to a bad start, for example, could that work in Trump's favor? Could it help to unite disenfranchised Republicans in any way?
I actually think there's two elections that are more important than this one. That when we talk about national, and that's the governor's races in New Jersey, which is next to New York City, and in Virginia. And the reason why I say that, it's interesting that in both cases, the Democratic candidates have about a 10% lead, but it's over Republicans. Remember, it's Mamdani versus Cuomo versus Sliwa in New York. So that's more of a traditional Democratic versus Republican contest. Now, New Jersey has been in Democratic control for quite some time. But Trump ran very well there in 24 against Biden. He closed the gap significantly. Now, can the Democrats reassert themselves in New Jersey? If they don't, that's a red flag for 26. And Virginia, I think, is even more interesting. It's what we call now purple state. It's not deep red Republican. It's not blue Democrat. It's been changing because the population's been changing, a very expanding suburban population, including that area close to Washington, D.C. So when Biden won in 2020, and more importantly, Democratic candidates did well in Virginia, it was part of that effect. Now, 24, it started to go back the other way. And significantly, Virginia has had a Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin. Representative Spooneybarger, who's the Democratic challenger, she's running against a black woman Trumpist, and a diehard Trumpist. If Spooneybarger wins that's a sign, Democrats can do well at the state level in 26. If this Trumpist, who, to be honest with you, really isn't been that effective a campaigner, if she wins despite that again is red flag for the Democrats. Because I'm going to say something here, because I hope we can come back to it when we chat again, and that is, everybody right now in the United States is like, what's happening at national level in terms of, how's Trump doing? Is he running, getting things all his own way? And, the Democrats, are they all in disarray? Or are they all panicking? Or are they all jumping like lemmings off a cliff? And it's not at national level where this stuff is happening. It's at state and local level that you look at it, because that's where you get the build to reach up to the national level. And so I think New York is a sign of what's happening, but we know that New York generally tends to go Democratic. How far Democrat, we'll see. Virginia and New Jersey, that's more of a test of where we're going to be in terms of that middle ground of the U.S. for the next 12 months.
I want to turn now to Trump launching an appeal to overturn his convictions on 34 counts of falsifying business records in the Stormy Daniels hush money case. His team, they submitted a filing on Monday arguing that Trump was a victim of the most politically charged prosecution in our nation's history and that he was shielded by presidential immunity. How do you see this playing out?
What the Trump folks are trying to do with this mid-level appeals court to reverse his conviction, which again was that $130 million payoff to Stormy Daniels just before the 2016 election, an attempt to basically affect the election result by keeping her quiet, and then by falsifying the business records of the Trump organization to pay his fixer, Michael Cohen, to cover him for paying off Daniels. Look, that's the Trump argument is, oh, I've got presidential immunity here. I got presidential immunity because I was president in January 2017, which is when the payoffs to Cohen took place. Okay, Daniels was paid off before the election. Trump pays off Cohen afterwards. Well, one merchant who heard the case, he threw that out like in the blink of an eye because he said, "No, this isn't anything to do with being president. You paying your guy because he paid a porn star to cover up your affair with her, your sexual encounter with her. That's not presidential behavior, son. That's private behavior." Now, will an appeals court buck that? I don't know. I don't think they would. There's certain testimony that the Trump folks say should not have been included. That includes his communications advisor, Hope Hicks. But again, the ruling from one merchant is that Hope Hicks was testifying not in her capacity as communications advisor to the president, not in terms of official business, but in a personal capacity, because she knew what had went on. I'm not going to say how a court will rule, because judges are human beings and judges can read the law definitely from the way that I would read it. But what I would say is politically, and this is the significance here, is Trump is trying to put himself above the law. And this is the one area in terms of criminal convictions where he has not been able to do so far. He is a convicted felon. And even though he got a conditional discharge 10 days before he took office, where he couldn't be put in prison for it, it's going to be on his record. He's been convicted in civil court on fraud. He's trying to reduce the amount of that, although I don't think he can overturn that conviction. And of course, he keeps coming because he couldn't overturn the civil court conviction for defamation based on his sexual assault on E. Jean Carroll. He's persecuting the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James. And that's the way Trump's going to operate. He's going to try to undo the law and try to undo the legal process. And I'll just add to this. Remember, he's actually saying, oh, because there were prosecutions against me, quite rightly, for the attempt to overturn the 2020 election, the Capitol attack, the Justice Department has to pay me money, I think, $130 million. Pay me, no, or $230 million, either 130 or 230 million, excuse the slip. It's like, what is this? So the Boyle is basically going around saying, look, I should not be held accountable for anything that I did in the courts. And by the way, give me some money for it. I'm the victim here, not the defendant. And this is just simply one piece of evidence.
Trump said that he's maintained that he didn't have sex with Stormy Daniels, and he's denied financial impropriety. But what I think is interesting is that, even with that convictions that we had last year for Trump, he still won the election, even despite having that convictions and still having that, that felon title over his head. But I'm wondering, this makes him, it's given him that title of being the first ever criminally convicted president. And even though he's denying the wrongdoing, that title still hangs over him, doesn't it? Do you think that the word felon is sort of like a thorn in his side that he's trying to get rid of?
Of course it is. But Joe, and I know you're trying to be balanced here, but again, let's be very clear. Interfering in an election to try to get yourself victory is a crime, okay? And we can talk about all kinds of forms of electoral interference. Bribing voters would be a crime, for example. Taking a campaign donation and not reporting it is a crime. In effect, Donald Trump spent $130,000 on a payoff to someone to stay quiet about their encounter days before the election as part of his campaign. That, in effect, is what he did. So for the Trump people to say, oh, well, there's nothing to see here, let's just move along, even though I, like I said, didn't quite make it through law school, even I know that that's flannel. And one merchant threw it out. And importantly, most importantly, the jury did. Donald Trump had a fair trial and he was convicted by the jury. So, that's what stings him. That's what stings him, that this was the one case they could not run the clock out on. And just remember the other ones that they did run the clock out on. The theft of documents from Mar-a-Lago, classified documents in some cases, top secret documents in some cases. They kept delaying and delaying and delaying. They succeeded. The case where the fake electors case in Georgia, trying to alter the 2020 election in Georgia. That was complicated a bit because the state district attorney, Fannie Willis, got herself into a bit of hot water over her personal affairs. But they ran the clock out on that. And then the one they ran the clock out on was the case that led up to January 6th and the Capitol attack. Now, let's be very clear here. Donald Trump escaped accountability, not because he was found innocent on that, but because you cannot put a sitting president on trial. And the argument is, oh, well, people elected him. People elected him anyway, knowing all of this. Well, yeah, fine. The legal system is separate from the political system. This happens. But, Berlusconi in Italy, despite his multiple court cases, he got elected by Italians. That's what happened. You've had Israeli politicians who've been elected and who have later been convicted of various crimes. Just because you were elected does not mean that you are above the law. But that's where Donald Trump wants to be.
But I mean, do you think just on a personal level, the word felon, it sits with him? Even though, as you mentioned, he still was able to win the election. Do you think that that word still sits with him?
Oh, it absolutely sticks on. I mean, it absolutely sticks because Donald Trump is this curious contradiction, which you can explain is on the one hand, he's the bully, he's the aggressor, he's the man, the art of the deal, and all that. On the other hand, he's insecure as hell. He really is insecure. And I know that's going to surprise a lot of people. And I can't wait to see the YouTube comments. But at the end of the day, he's this bully that wants to be liked. And it just drives him crazy. He wants the adulation. He wants all of that. He wants people to pay him tribute. And for that to happen, he can't be like the ultimate villain who enjoys just being a villain. He can't say, yeah, I got away with it. He's the villain who at the end of the day wants to be the hero. And when you get yourself in that position, you're always going to be uncertain of whether you can pull off that con trick. And he's pulled off a lot of con tricks, but this may be the one that he can't achieve unless, and Joe, this is the significance, unless he breaks the entire U.S. system, just breaks down the legal system, breaks the political system, and then he gets to say, I get to be all these things at once. Bully, art of the deal, and you love me as well, even if I had to make you love me.
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you, Joe.